Thank you everyone for joining in, and I'm pleasured to be moderating such an esteemed set of panelists. Without much ado, I'll just directly hand it over to our panelists. In terms of process, we'd like to hear some starting thoughts from you guys. Let's try to keep it brief, and then we can go into the discussion, and hopefully, if time permitting, we can also go to the audience for any questions. Yeah, I'll start with you, Shloka.
I can go to the podium if that's Hi everyone, and thank you to the Mumbai First team for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. For those of you who don't know much about the ICC, the India Climate Collaborative is really an organization that aims to identify critical sectors that need investment. We look to drive funding towards climate solutions here in India, and we also look to work with philanthropists as well as civil society organizations to engage more effectively with climate action. So through this work, we really seek to bring more funding into the climate space. We look to enable that funding to be used more effectively. And we hope to support businesses and communities move towards a greener, more equitable and climate resilient future. So I really want to start by commending the Mumbai First team here today for holding this very critical discussion on climate finance, especially in the context of increasing resilience in coastal cities. So while climate finance is often bundled into one homogeneous group, there are in fact many layers and nuances to it, as many as there are climate issues. So for every sector and every challenge, we do require a different form of capital to address it. And while many of the mitigation actions, whether it's renewable energy or sustainable mobility, they are moving towards having a definitive business case, they can attract, more commercial capital. Other climate solutions are yet to receive the funding that they actually require. So to give you a good example, in the absence of a clear pricing around climate risk, many actions around building resilience are and continue to be funded by grant capital. Coastal cities specifically, Mumbai of course is a great example, lie at the forefront of climate disasters, and they are likely to need a substantial amount of catalytic as well as soft support. So the ICC has, and we continue to maintain, that there is an increased need for domestic donors to come forward to start funding climate action here in India. We have, of course, the likes of Mr. Godrej here, who's been leading this movement for many, many years, but we do need more such incredible philanthropists. So currently, less than 2% of global giving, just to give you a sense of sort of what the gap is, less than 2% of global giving goes towards climate action. And this number is likely to be far lower in India. While many donors in India have embarked on their climate funding journey, they are more comfortable investing in climate adjacent areas. So, Indian foundations, CSR organizations actually engage very deeply with climate aligned sectors. You've got agriculture, water, livelihoods, just to name a few, but they don't actually always apply that very necessary climate lens. And what we found is that while donors are interested, they actually lack, access to quality opportunities, as well as the requisite climate knowledge that they need. What should we fund? What do good climate solutions actually look like? Those are massive entry barriers. So this actually results in funding, of course, being directed to less impactful solutions. And it's also concentrated amongst a few geographies and actors across India. Simultaneously, we've also seen India's corporates, really ramp up their commitments to climate action. Even amongst CSR, we are seeing an increased urgency in funding towards climate. So the parent companies of 41 of the top 50 private CSRs have committed to climate initiatives, as have companies from high emission sectors such as manufacturing, power, chemicals. As of 2019, the country has the 5th largest number of corporates committed to the Science Based Targets initiative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally. And these commitments are also translating into their CSR strategies. According to our analysis, the ICC's analysis of the top 10 private CSRs here in India, spending on climate adjacent sectors has actually grown faster than other sectors since 2014-2015. So it's clear that the funding ecosystem is right, but there is need to not only unlock this capital, but also direct it strategically towards impactful and scalable climate solutions to really catalyze the Indian climate ecosystem. So the future presents a challenge. We're really looking for India's leaders to rise to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nath. Some insights, very hard-hitting, like less than 2% of grants going to climate financing and slightly much lower in India. Would like to dive a bit deeper into that when we go to the discussion. Let me then also invite Mr. Hisham for his starting thoughts.
Good morning, everyone. One of the things that Shloka didn't say is, in her role, I thought we were going to sit and talk, but she stood and talked, and when Shloka stands, the rest of the Indian climate community follows suit. So my name is Hisham. I'm with the Environmental Defense Fund. We're a not-for-profit, and our mission in India is to support governments, the private sector, civil society, for a uniquely Indian pathway to shared sustainable prosperity. I think there's lots of signs that this pathway is being constructed in India. I want to particularly compliment Mumbai first and what is happening in Maharashtra. There is something happening on climate change in Maharashtra that the rest of the country, and indeed I dare say much of the world, is looking at. At a very basic level, Maharashtra seems to be looking at climate change and saying this is that big green growth opportunity, and it's awesome seeing that from outside the city. So compliments to everyone in the city. We look at coastal cities from a basics perspective. There's a risk. There's a sea level rise risk. There's also a constraint. There's only part of the city that you can do stuff in, the rest of it is water. We look at Mumbai and say, from the outside world, it looks like Mumbai has, is the richest metropolis in the country, it's rolling in money. Why on earth would it be concerned about coastal financing? Because resilience measures to address things like sea level change cost a lot of money in general. They cost even more when you have the sea right next to you and there's only so much you can do. What therefore is our thought process around what can be done around financing? It is entirely about risk, right? That is what is the key criteria here. There is a risk associated with sea level rises. That risk causes two things to happen. There are folks who understand the risk and then choose either not to fund or to increase the cost of capital. There are folks who don't understand the risk and therefore don't see the value in funding resilience. Those are the two dynamics. And what our recommendation is, take that risk head on and do two things. One, focus on risk transparency. Start tracking and recording and reporting that risk far more openly. The one thing investors want more than anything else is transparency. And if they are clear about what they are buying into, there is a much better chance of your being able to generate more money that way. The second is on resilience, is in parallel, start using those risk statements to prioritize where you're going to build your infrastructure or where you're going to prioritize your resilience efforts. And the other part of resilience, which I would urge a lot, is every time we've seen this, making the climate argument alone for resilience is just not good enough. We have to make a political and an economic and a social argument. We're trying to support some work in New York City, actually, to generate a $4 billion resilience fund. The primary argument there is 100,000 new jobs. That is the selling argument, and we have to be thinking jobs, we have to be thinking livelihoods, even though we care about climate. And it's not because we care less about climate. It's because if you don't get the jobs and the politics right, the action just won't happen. The second aspect I'll say is, think about the various building blocks that would be needed. We need, Vandana spoke earlier about educating officials in a municipal level. There is a large amount of education that needs to happen on city planners, on builders and developers, on customers like us. We have to integrate risk disclosure with infrastructure decisions. So the prioritization of an infrastructure effort has to be based on the risk that is underlying that effort. And we have to use that integration to do two things: create better standards if they're required, building standards or whatever, municipal planning standards. The other thing that I would say is think about the governance around it. What we've seen in other cities is the equivalent of a chief resilience officer can play the role of doing two things. One is to make sure that vulnerability assessments are generated across sectors, and the second is that there are effective mitigation plans. And I don't want to propose a new structure just because it's fashionable and we have a new, something to run after, but you need somebody whose full-time job it is to look at vulnerability. The last point on funding is, where are those avenues of funding? There is those community bonds that you can raise. There is impact bonds that you can raise. But what I would think that Mumbai would be well served to look at is on carbon markets. There is a large amount of carbon offsets that are available. A lot of it is going to forestry right now. So we've, for example, recently supported the creation of $1 billion fund called LEAF, which is forestry financing, but it's not unrealistic to think we can extend that to mangroves and wetlands, where Mumbai plays a much bigger role. And think about voluntary carbon markets, voluntary blue carbon markets. What I mean by this is, if you have an oil and gas company and they take a net zero target, it is unlikely that they can mitigate. They have to purchase offsets. So get them to purchase offsets in and around Mumbai that help the city. The end objective of all of this is more money directed at the right things, hence the infrastructure prioritization, and reduce costs in terms of cost of capital or insurance premium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hisham. Some very interesting thoughts around the governance part and also what else would be the catalyst for driving the change. Appreciate that. Let me then go to Mr. Bhatt for his remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Devi. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mumbai First, for having invited me to share our work and our experiences. But before I go there, I think Hisham put me on the spot saying everybody has to follow what Shloka did. So, but with Shloka's permission, I would like to come up with an innovation of sitting down rather than standing up. In terms of my opening remarks, I think it's difficult to talk about themes that have not been touched, to be candid, because you have had an eclectic set of people, starting with the visionary business leader in form of Mr. Godrej, Sanjeev doing a great job in summarizing all the conversations from yesterday, catalysts like Shloka talking about how things need to change. So let me, touch upon a few of the aspects around those dimensions. I think first and foremost, when we look at regulatory or institutional dimensions, I think everybody kind of seems to align on the fact that you need an integrated approach, a government of whole or whole of government approach kind of a setup to start with, right? You could crystallize it under a chief resilience officer. You could do it under, existing institutions. The challenge there is, how do you further bring in capacities, technical, management, financial understanding? So that's one. Second, I think, is a lot of focus has been in the past on mitigation. And even within mitigation, not a lot of thought is given to resilience. So even with the projects, like the renewable energy projects, or as India, since we'll continue to have thermal as a mix, you have a significant resilient dimension, whether the nature of water that is used, etc., and the productivity and the implications thereof. So I think that's the second part, because for a city like Mumbai, infrastructure, energy, health will continue to be the core pillars on which any private sector action will survive. or thrive, right? So if you're not able to build it out, private sector will do its own job, in my view, in making sure their own operations survive to the extent, but their horizons of action are much shorter, because that's how we have evolved our capital markets, unfortunately. And so there needs to be a rethink on that front. I think the other aspect on this is, how do you kind of look at risk? Hashim talked about risk. I think starting point there is, we do not even have a formal definition of what is climate positive, right? We have a thematic dimension, but when you start looking at a project level or a subsectoral level, what are the appropriate dimensions for you to consider is missing. There is some work, we as C Kinetics, we are a sustainability advisory and investments firm. We have been doing a lot of work in this space, including looking at green finance taxonomies, coming up with models which could allow for better ESG integration, etc. And our work in carbon markets, you talked about, yes, there is an appetite, increasing appetite in nature-based solutions, etc. But I don't think that is well understood either on the public sector side or even private sector side. I think a lot of focus continues to be, how does my renewable energy footprint look like? Can I do great with it? Frankly, in the voluntary markets, the pricing has been pretty low, and it will only go further because the dimension of additionality that would normally prop it up is no longer required, right? So I think the nature-based solutions have a path forward, but I don't think there's enough work done. I think so. First and foremost is, yes, disclosure of climate risk is a prerequisite, but what is risk itself needs to get defined. And then how do you price that risk? I think the biggest problem in resilience is you're not able to have a model for valuing the attributes of that resilient action in a very definitive, and a comparable metric as things stand today. So there's a lot of work needed on that front before it becomes, so there's a work related around standards, that work related around, and you need to contextualize it to local requirements and local context. So I don't think a coastal resilience pan-India program will work. I think there'll be different considerations in different cities, etc. The other part, I think, is around, since Shloka touched upon the theme of role of philanthropic money in this. I think today everybody is talking of impact capital and blended finance, but our regulatory dimensions are fairly, I would say, limited in exploring that space in a big way. So you would need to relook at that in a significant way, both in the banking sector and how you kind of integrate blended financing there, even in use of, credit guarantees and stuff like that, So, even simple things like subrogation rights, etc., for an international player are limited, at least based on past norms. There is no act per se for private sector to set up guarantee funds. You can obviously set up it, but there's no formal structure, right? The other dimension when you look at this, in my view, when you're looking at it from a regulatory perspective, is how do you create pathways for blending some of these mechanisms which have already existed? A point in case is a good hazard mitigation instrument clubbed with an insurance structure, right? Can you do that well? Because individually those instruments have existed, but if you can bring that together, you'll be able to price risk better, and as Hisham, you mentioned, it can bring down pricing in a substantive way. Because unless you can transmit that pricing, etc., a lot of talk that we have will remain talk, because a developer will say, it doesn't matter whether I'm coming with a green labeled instrument or not, or a blue labeled instrument or not, because my pricing remains the same, and there is additional monitoring and verification burden that I am undergoing. So can I just... So I think we need to relook at it from that point of view, because the labeled instruments is the way to go, but the M&V on that, and how do you kind of make it really scalable becomes important. There have been several attempts done on that front. And I think to the end, and we can come back to this, I think the public-private partnership approach that people talk about, because resilience or adaptation is being seen more and more as a public sector thing. That is true for many things, but is not true for everything. So for example, all the commercial properties on the Bombay coastline, they're all private sector, right? So how do you so they have a vested interest to build it out. So how do you frame this in a fashion where institutional capacities recognize the opportunity and the regulatory mechanisms kind of have a forward view. Today, if you look at the Indian regulatory space, we have just come up with a BRSR for corporates, but there the climate dimension is pretty muted, I would say. And it is, yes, I recognize and appreciate SEBI's effort that S is a core component, but I think S and the climate in E will become more and more interwoven if you want to really make an impact on ground. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Bhatt. Very insightful thoughts again. Let's go to Mr. Dhruva. I see him on screen there.
Good morning. Hello. Good morning. Can I start?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mumbai First, and everyone else for inviting me into the session. My apologies. I could not be there in person. I've got COVID and recovering from COVID. So thanks for this opportunity to speak on such an important session. Following up on the luminous speakers before me, Hisham, Shloka, Upendra, I just want to dive straight into the theme of the session, which is the regulatory and institutional framework for mobilizing climate finance for coastal cities. And to start with, on risk and opportunity, my apologies, I'll be speaking a little softly. On risk and opportunity, it's a double-edged sword. In climate and climate finance, we talk of risks as a physical risk and a transition risk. The physical risk, people have talked about, it's been repeated. It is there, it is on us. We can see the change. So without delving into that, the whole issue is, what comes first? Does the risk come first or the opportunity come first? Or are they together? It's a very complex situation because from a policymaker's perspective, and we have a lot of legislators and policymakers in this forum, so I'll come to that part. It's an issue of physical risk. We need to mitigate carbon emissions, and surely there is every stakeholder there. But at the same time, the very actions for mitigation leads to a transition risk, which affects companies, which affects people. You're talking of replacement of vehicles, you're talking of higher costs of steel, higher costs of energy, closing down or reducing coal emissions and so on. So all of this have got a wide-ranging first, second order socio-economic impact. So that has to be thought of. But at the same point of time, this transition that we sort of embark on for mitigating a global public good, we have to keep our focus limited to saying what is vulnerable. Mumbai is vulnerable. It's very well known and documented. And therefore, what needs to be done? Let's focus on that. I think adaptation needs a priority here. Resilience, sure, for sure, on a longer term. But immediately, one needs to build a stronger built infrastructure, as they call it in adaptation, against heat, against natural elements, against floods, against over rainfall, excess rainfall, protecting ecosystems. Primarily, we are coming across to these areas. A little bit on food and health, of course, might creep in. So therefore, there is a need to focus on adaptation investments, which I think, given the IPCC's second report comes out more as a priority. Mitigation contributions will carry on. They're a part of the overall reduction in global greenhouse gases. And therefore, how does this lead to mobilizing? Therefore, increased finance is required. Yes, let's focus on finance. Increased money is required. And increased money for whom? Increased money for Mumbai. Increased money for coastal cities. And how does that happen? So money and finance has got a private sector and a market side, and has got a public finance side. We all tend to, I would not say inordinately, but the focus is on private commercial finance, bonds, grants, philanthropy also, all of it, CSR. But let me take this away to saying that this is a public problem. This is ultimately a public issue. It's ultimately a public good problem. and therefore there needs to be a concentration also on public finance. How does public finance come in? How does public finance come into Mumbai? Mumbai has got four urban local bodies, one development authority. And how do they raise financing? Because commercially viable business models, thinking around, great if it is commercially viable, public-private partnerships on infrastructure, on protecting sea level rise, on the embankments, all of it does need to get created. Therefore, a large amount of finance is required even for transitioning, for some amount of transition which will need social protection money when people will have to shift lifestyles, shift livelihoods. So let's look at the institutional and regulatory framework for financing for coastal cities or any city for that matter. And I'll step back here and raise regulation, institutional framework regulation to one step over that. And I think it's policy and law at some level. And what we need to start with, we need to start looking at first at the 12th schedule, revisit the 74th amendment, the 12th schedule of the Constitution. I think that needs revisiting. And that revisiting becomes important. Why? Because India's fiscal federalism goes from an economic activity place, a huge economic activity place, where taxation is at the center, gets redistributed through a finance commission. And that's important that we green public finance transfers. If you look at today, the framework at which it comes to the states, and I'll come to the next level. And the next level of the framework is the Article 243. And the Article 243 requires State Finance Commission. State finance commissions need to recognize this part in terms of transfer of public resources towards dedicated activity by the municipal corporation, by the development authority. I read a couple of days ago, or was it yesterday only, one development authority, one civic body was announced by the minister. And I think it's a great initiative in terms of being able to mobilize. Now, in order to mobilize, so once we have a public finance architecture, a green finance definition, as Upendra was saying, a green finance definition of public finance in the public budgets, the devolution of money needs to get directed. That's I think, is a step one. And we surely need an amendment here. Further amendment to the 74th Amendment, which brings in, which till today has not empowered. So what is the access to finance for a local body? The access to finance is dependent on all property taxes and others that it enables. There, of course, some coastal cities are rich from a municipality point of view. We look at the core public finance first and then start thinking of leveraging public finance to the markets. And leveraging public finance to the markets will require subsequent actions which have been spoken of. The nature of bonds, tapping into green, tapping into sustainability-linked bonds, tapping into blue bonds, tapping into many such sources which the municipality or the local body concerned can do so. But to start with, we need to link intergovernmental transfers significantly to green activity and to vulnerability. And very important, and this, if we need the change in institutional framework, is the formula for Central Finance Commission for allocation of the 42% and the weightage given for vulnerability of coastal cities. You need more finance there because they are more vulnerable, whether they will more vulnerable. And at the next level, again, the intergovernmental transfers to the municipality, to the local body, again, need to be similarly indexed. Finally, insurance. It's important that insurance against climate risk, which is not present in India effectively. Insurance is often in India is loss and damage, what is called property and casualty insurance. Climate requires insurance to be taken from an event-specific metric, not linked to loss and damage. and that's protection. Not linked to loss and damage, not linked to assessment. Today, when we have non-life insurance, we are talking about our cars or our vehicles damaged, and there is an assessment. Whereas there is an alternative form of climate insurance called parametric insurance. And I think India has started it. Agricultural insurance company has launched a parametric insurance product, and Swiss Re has effectively insured districts in Nagaland against excess rainfall. So we need to look at Mumbai from an insurance point of view through a parametric insurance lens. So parametric insurance, public finance, and possibly an amendment to the 12th schedule and following Article 243. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, and very well summarized at the end. Very clear next set of actions that you think are important. Then I think there's a short video message from Mr. Amarjeet. If we can get on the screen, and then we can go to the discussion part.
Good morning. Apologies, I couldn't be there in person. Let me straight away get onto the subject and start at a broader level. During the last few years, as all of us know, there is a surge in global efforts to address climate change. Countries, including India, have made a number of important commitments in the recent COP26 towards curbing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning to clean energy sources. There has, as we all know, there has been a lot of talk globally, and I believe it's time that countries start focusing more on implementation and walk the talk. As per the Climate Change Performance Index 2022, this I think is an important data point here, which analyzes and compares the climate protection performance of 63 countries and the EU. India is ranked at number 10, and obviously it is amongst the top 10 performing countries. CCPI report also finds that India is on track to meet its 2030 emissions targets. So I believe climate change conversations and actions have to decentralize. The country level plans have to percolate down to the state level, district level, and the city level in an integrated manner. It is heartening to note that the city of Mumbai has set out a climate action plan. I believe in this context, this particular event, this conference, focusing on climate crisis facing the coastal cities is a very important and very timely and relevant initiative. So my compliments to the organizers. What I would like to very briefly share with you is, what our engagements at Securities and Exchange Board of India are vis-a-vis the climate or the sustainability issues. We are working in 4 distinct areas when it comes to sustainability issues. One is the area of sustainability disclosures by listed companies. Second is the area relating to sustainable finance. Third, ESG ratings. And fourth, we are also looking at ESG schemes of mutual funds. But before I get to each of these specific areas in brief, just to sort of set the context, let me mention that there are mainly 2 driving forces in the ESG world. So the first one, and I think the first one is more powerful one also, is the investors. There has been a growing awareness and consciousness among investors and society in general on ESG or sustainability issues. As a result, these issues are becoming increasingly more dominant in driving the behavior of investors. As per the Morningstar data, the global sustainable fund assets have more than tripled in the past 2 years, from a little over USD 900 billion at the end of March 2020 to USD 2.8 trillion at the end of March 2022. Europe accounts for around 82% of this asset under management, and US accounts for around 12%. If you look at our region, the Asian region, I think we are way behind in the region as a whole. Sustainable funds in Asia account for about 4% only of the global AUM. But I think this region is catching up, and there is significant growth happening in terms of new fund flows and ESG product launches. If you look at the Indian example more specifically, there are 10 ESG thematic equity schemes in India, in our markets. And what is interesting to note is that out of these 10 schemes, 8 were launched after January 2020. In addition to investors, the second driving force in the ESG world is the governments and regulators like us. While as a regulator, we may be agnostic to where investors should invest, we have an important role to play in the area of ESG disclosures and also regulating greenwashing or mis-selling in the name of ESG schemes. And I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end of my speech. But, in India, if you just look at our legislative intent, so broader legislative intent in India on sustainability issues has been ahead of the curve, if I can say. The Companies Act, the new Companies Act rather, which was passed in 2013, it required a director of a company to act in the best interest not only of the company, the employees, but also the community and the protection of the environment. The SEBI regulations echo similar expectations. SEBI had introduced sustainability reporting way back. Again, I think we were ahead of the curve vis-a-vis many other jurisdictions in 2012. A new framework for ESG reporting has been prescribed in the during the last year. And this new report, the new reporting format is called the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report, or BRSR. And it lays significant emphasis on outcome-oriented quantitative disclosures. The disclosures on climate and social-related issues of the listed entity have been significantly enhanced in this new format, and they've been made more granular. So I believe there are more than 500 data points in this particular framework. Just to give you a flavor of, what the disclosure requirements are, especially on the environment side or on the climate related issues. So these include disclosures on greenhouse gas emissions, not only scope 1 and scope 2, but also scope 3 emissions on a voluntary basis. Scope 1 and 2 are on mandatory basis. Air pollutant emissions such as NOx, SOx, particulate matter, energy consumption through renewable and non-renewable sources, water withdrawal, water consumption, water discharge, biodiversity, waste generation, waste management. There's a long list. Just to give you an example, it's fairly wide, and it is all quantitative, and it's a kind of a massive leap vis-a-vis the earlier reporting format. This new BRSR, it shall be applicable to the top 1,000 listed companies on a mandatory basis from this current financial year 22-23. However, entities can choose to adopt it on a voluntary basis from financial year 21-22. Which means those who are adopting for the previous year will have to report it by September this year. So just to sort of wrap up on BRSR, I believe that's what the feedback we have from the market sources, that it will hopefully bring in greater transparency through disclosure of material ESG related information, and those disclosures should help the market participants to identify and assess the sustainability related risks and opportunities in the market. Let me very briefly talk about the climate finance and the role we are trying to play there. Just to state the obvious, India will need substantial financing to meet its climate goals. It will be very important to identify and explore innovative instruments to meet these requirements. So SEBI had, in 2017, laid down the regulatory framework for green bonds. So green bonds is an avenue for channelizing funds in green activities, and those green activities for which these bonds can be issued, there's a list of activities which are prescribed in the framework. So some of those items include renewable and sustainable energy, including wind, solar, bioenergy and other sources of energy, clean transportation, sustainable water management and climate change adaptation, etc. After the issuance of this framework by SEBI, there have been 15 issuances of green bonds in the country, amounting to approximately $570 million, about 4,500 crores till date. But I guess this is an area, where we can do much more, and we are currently examining how we can increase traction in green bond issuances. Let me move to another area which is engaging our attention, and that is the area of ESG ratings. ESG rating, we believe there is an increasing demand from investors for rating of ESG related parameters. And typically, my sense is world over, the activities of the ESG rating providers, they are not subject to any significant regulatory oversight at present. And the investors have to rely on the unregulated ESG rating providers. So there are concerns about the potential risks which creep up in case an activity is unregulated. So we've issued a consultation paper seeking feedback on the need for regulating ESG rating providers and how we can go around that. As regards ESG mutual fund schemes, our main concern is that such schemes should be true to their label and should not mislead investors. So pursuant to, we had done a extensive consultation on this subject also with all stakeholders. And pursuant to that, we have directed the Association of Mutual Funds in India, AMFI, to issue the norms pertaining to ESG disclosures. Finally, as I said, our main concern in the ESG investing is greenwashing and mis-selling and not being true to the label. Let me just illustrate that with a couple of examples. So recent research has found out that, and this is a global example. In fact, I have two examples, both are global. One is that the actions of the 4 major global oil and gas companies, their actions and investment behavior were not in alignment with what was stated in their annual reports and what were the pledges made by them. The study has found a strong increase in disclosures or discourse related to climate, low carbon transition, and increasing mention of strategies related to decarbonization and clean energy from 2009 to 2020. So the study of spanning over about 11 years as to, what were apparently the commitments made by them on all these areas. So what has been found out is that these pledges on clean energy were not backed by corporate action, such as, investment in clean energy. And also, I mean, just to give you a broader sense of it, the study concluded that the accusations of greenwashing were apparently well founded. So there was a disconnect between what you were talking and what you were actually doing. To give you another example, a few days ago, the USA SEC's Climate and ESG Task Force issued its first enforcement action against a large Brazilian mining company, charging the company for making false and misleading claims about the safety of its dams prior to the collapse of one of its dams in 2019. The dam collapse killed 270 people. It caused immeasurable environmental and social harm and led to a loss of more than $4 billion in the company's market capitalization. So the allegation that has been made by SEC is that the company's sustainability reports, which were in the public domain, they fraudulently assured investors that the company adhered to the strictest international practices in evaluating dam safety, and by manipulating these disclosures, the company undermined investors' ability to evaluate the risks which were there when they were investing in this company. So these are a couple of examples of greenwashing. So as a regulator, I mean, all over the world, we have to sort of, keep our eye on such malpractices and take timely action. Finally, just to conclude, while we are apparently making progress, I believe we still have a long way to go on climate front, and all the stakeholders, whether it is investors, companies, regulators, civil society, I think all of us have to come together to deal with the challenges. I once again compliment the organizers for organizing this timely event. Thanks for your attention and your patience. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amanjeet. Some very important thoughts from an important stakeholder. And good to see that SEBI is doing so much to improve transparency in risk reporting, and also how the funds are flowing. To Mr. Hisham's point earlier, that's what the investors are mainly looking for, transparency of risks, and such initiatives and regulations try to institutionalize that. Before we go to the discussion, I was just trying to wrap my head around what has been said. In my mind, there are like three key parts. There's the source of fund or the supply. You have the demand of fund, and then you have in the middle the institutions like enabling the funds going from one to other. On the other side, you have the government as the source of fund and also using the fund for public good. You have the philanthropies who are using, who have fund from different sources, and they are using for both public and private good. And then you have the private funds who are going more towards the private capital and the private goods. So if we keep that in mind, let me start with you, Shloka. You mentioned that you work with the philanthropies and foundations, which goes to projects which are, is it mostly related to public benefit or is it also for private benefit? And what are the challenges? Is it more on the funding side that we are seeing the challenges? Is it lack of projects or lack of intermediation? Where is the problem and where can we find a solution?
I'm going to say all three, all of the above. So I think let me just start by sort of trying to, add to what my panelists here have said. I think they made some very important points, and maybe I can address some of the barriers that you've mentioned and then talk a little bit about what the solutions possibly could be. I think the first point that was made, actually by all of you, Dhruba really emphasized this as well, was the cascading nature of public finance. So we do have a mismatch between, what the share of the city really is. It's determined, obviously, by a corpus that's set aside at the national level, and it's then allocated to the state level. And Upendra, you made a really important point about, how local context when it comes to different cities really counts. I would actually add to that Indian cities also vary in fiscal status and credit worthiness. So you've got to sort of apply, differential context here in terms of how you supply that finance, and that's a major gap in terms of public finance. The second is a lack of institutional capacity. Actually, Ms. Jawan had, sort of alluded to this earlier as well. She talked about the capacity or the need for capacity building at the level of the authorities who work within municipal corporations. I would actually also add that there is a need to really sort of equip them to mobilize climate finance more. This is, something that we live and breathe at the ICC. We're just constantly sort of churning out how we address this challenge of mobilizing finance. I know my colleagues here do as well. And really, while Upendra has also talked about, the need for more sort of financial instruments like municipal green bonds, etc., there's actually no institution that can take on the role of coordinating finance at the city level and at the local level. So how do you really sort of promote institutional capacity building such that you can coordinate a strategy, a set of mechanisms at the city level, and that really has to come through the state climate action plans. The third, and I know my colleagues agree with me as well, we really believe this at the ICC, climate is one of the biggest, most existential threats of our time. In my books, all finance needs to be climate finance. There's just no escaping that. Especially at the city level, both, again, Dhruba, Upendra, Hisham, I forgot your name for a second, thank you. Hisham, all of you have, said that as well. The fact that we need to build resilience at creating, and create climate resilient infrastructure. It's not just the job of a specially earmarked, green climate fund. I think we have to move beyond that. It's really all sources of capital that need to be green now, whether it's, your capital markets, your banks, your financial instruments, your institutional investors. Capital flows have to be climate resilient. So let's just get our thinking straight about that. One thing that I think Upendra really sort of hit on, which I think is absolutely crucial, is the need for a very clear taxonomy and standardization around, what we mean when we say climate finance. And I think that has to be driven centrally by the Indian government. We do need an alignment of all capital flows. Dhruba, you had pointed this out as well, but I think we also need to talk about how we can track this corpus and these state funds, right? There are massive gaps in identifying and quantifying where these financial flows are moving. Just to give you an example, there are studies that have been done that have found that investment in urban mitigation actually outweighs, urban adaptation and resilience. So this is actually a real cause for concern. The Minister for Environment pointed this out yesterday, that we've got escalating climate disasters, the rate at which our cities are expanding. How do we use data, evidence to really start tracking, and making more informed and deliberate decision making around that? Finally, I know I'm over time, but I just wanted to quickly say that, with regards to the private sector and philanthropic institutions and sort of increasing their efforts towards, directing more financial flows towards climate action, that's already happening, Divi. I don't think that we have an issue around sort of seeing that flow starting to increase. I think there are gaps. We need to apply a more conscious climate lens across, that funding, and we need to make sure that that funding is systemic and that it's moving towards actual impact rather than being sporadic and not sort of adding up to very much. I'll pause here. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Shloka. Let me just bring us back. I mean, has been iterated multiple times in all the speeches that we need finance, we need finance, we need finance. Clear. How do you use finance? My view is whatever projects are NPV positive, if you're setting up a solar plant, I am guessing, you guys can correct me, it is easy to get finance. where projects are not NPV positive, is where we are lacking finance, or whereas there's no business case at all, that it's just public good, you will not get any money. Where are we stuck? We need finance is clear, but is it that we have lack of stakeholders asking for finance? Is it lack of institutions who cannot get finance? Because what I have been told is there's a lot of private interest of spending money and there are funds, etc. Any thoughts from any of you? You can.
Yeah, on this actually, there is even a lack of financing in renewables. Let's start with that. I mean, there has obviously been an unlock on the utility scale, but the distributed, and I think just yesterday the data came out that India will miss its target for 2022 by 24%, all because of lack of distributed renewables not getting to the target of 40 gigawatts. So this number will go up threefold by 2030, because when we are talking of being on track with 2030 goals, we are talking pre-COP announcements. We still do not know how the 450 gigawatt will split. My sense is you'll end up at about 270, 280 on solar. Out of that, about 100 would be distributed. And if that's the case, you have a tough challenge. So I think there is money available at a macro sense. The intermediation process for that historically has been very, very complex, be it on the public sector side, private sector side, that doesn't matter. So what we need is, in addition to what we've spoken around demystifying climate, thematically describing how do you do it, etc., risk, is looking at it at three levels. One, where and what sources of capital are best suited to address this. So the starting point would be a comprehensive planning and strategy for your climate plan for a city, divvying it up in different buckets. Second, setting up a project preparation facility. So a lot of capital does get intermediated at pilot project level, where you even blended finance, etc., you can do. But when you start looking at it at scale, or even credit enhancement, guarantees, they're all at relatively minuscule scale compared to the order of magnitude that you need. So you need a project preparation facility of sorts at a city level if you can, and that's where I think Shloka's pointed out a systemic change, as also empowering people with capacity and knowledge becomes important. The second thing I think what you need is looking at these instruments very differently, because as you were just talking about NPV outcomes, etc., many of the adaptation oriented projects, right? In mitigation, the numbers work, but the sponsor companies may still be in a nascent stage. At some level, you will get unlock it. That's how you went through the renewables. You're now seeing slowly in electric mobility, and over a period of time, debt will flow. But you will not see that in several adaptation segments, because you still do not know how to price that risk and how do you then value that outcome that you're seeing. So you need results-based financing framework and standards and mechanisms to do that. And I think it's more complicated, in my view, to structure these things in adaptation and resilience, because, versus mitigation, because the results-based financing framework is perfect for those projects, but there's not enough work done. So those are the three areas where I think work is needed, and you would need a very innovative regulator to support it, because you will have to course correct as you go with this.
Can I just add one point? The climate change crisis is not being caused by what we are doing today. It is being caused by what has happened in the past. And one of the major points that India makes in every international negotiation is we are 1/10 the per capita emissions of the US and 1/4 or 1/5 of China and the Europeans. Now, climate justice does not mean the right to pollute. That doesn't make strategic sense. But climate justice means that India should show global leadership and continue to show that global leadership and bring along as many low per capita emissions countries as it can, and continue to put pressure on the higher per capita emission countries, because it's, we've had enough talk. It's now time for them to show the money. You need a Marshall Plan equivalent of technology transfer and financing. That's what the need of the hour is.
Great point, great point. I think that also goes yet another source of financing. And then to get to your point about intermediation, I know Hesham, you spoke about voluntary carbon markets. Where are we stuck there? Is it like, at the policy level, people don't realize it's important, or is it they realize it? Where is the inertia? Some countries have already mentioned it. They're already thinking about increasing the prices through regulation. Why are we, it feels as though we are 3-4 steps behind. Why is that?
So I think we are, I don't know if it's 3 or 4 or 1 or 2 steps, so whatever, we are a little behind. One of the barriers was that there was a concern that the Indian government had around carbon markets, which was that if there was, for example, a corporate that purchased offsets, the corporate got to count it against its net zero targets, but did the country where the corporate base was the corporate base, was that also double counting? Now, at the recent COP, that got resolved, which is a good thing, because now it's clear that if it's a corporate, the corporate gets to count it and the country doesn't count it. And I think naturally the Indian government had some concerns around that. I don't think enough people amongst policymakers are familiar with it and this policy shift, and it would be good if the national government were to then clarify that we're now good with this, and therefore encourage a lot more state governments to put in state or city governments, because the next stage now is for state and city governments to start applying for this source of funding. This source of financing is not going to meet the $800 billion or the $1 trillion that India needs, but it could be a reasonable amount of money.
Got it. Thank you. I realize we have less than 2 minutes left. I just want to leave it to the audience if there are any questions to our eminent panelists. I skipped this yesterday and I got beaten up for this, so I'm just checking that box. It's 2 minutes. Good. Okay. Any other closing remarks? I know, Mr. Drupa, maybe I'll ask one question for you as well. You spoke about how the center-state partnership works. Is there, on the governance, we mentioned need for a chief resilience officer. They talk about chief sustainability officer. We had also what we said, like when India was to digitize, there was a digital India kind of a run. Are we missing those kind of mandates from a, how do you turn that 2070 net zero to the more practical 2030, 2040, 2050 milestones, not just at a central level, also at a state level? Is that translation happening? Do you need that? I think he's on mute.
Okay. Sorry, I was on mute. My immediate response is yes to the initiative that you're laying out. But I want to couple of emphasize more fundamentals in terms of saying where the problem is and what can be done. And that's why I'm lifting the problem to the policy level. And why am I lifting the problem to the policy level is because climate, whether it is mitigation or an adaptation, both of them are market failures. And essentially, you don't have private sector, a natural business model there. Of what we see here in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, in LED lamp and lighting in India, they're all policy creating markets. So the policy needs to create those markets, and therefore the markets will respond. I think to my mind, it's a very important recognition, and we need to get away from this ranting of we are not the contributor, and therefore, yes, we are not the contributor. And there has been, again, a broken record of 100 billion from actually Copenhagen 2010 that has been going around. The question is, it's a hard problem for countries to resolve. But where? And I think Hisham pointed it out. Article 6, by the way, India was one of the kind of drafters for the Article 6 resolution, A and B both. And and I agree with him, and if we find a resolution, what is important for mitigation is, mitigation actions are important for global, and they are important, and the contribution should be priced through carbon. It's an economic good, and somebody needs to pay for it. Yes, I agree. If the part 1 countries or the global north could pay for the global south, great, but we still don't have that mechanism. There would have to be necessarily a commercial price, whether offsets do not do the job. Offsets are a zero-sum game. they do not do the job of an overall reduction. But more importantly, we need to, and I emphasize here, we need to look at adaptation for coastal cities, and for that, there will be little private finance possible. We need to address cyclones in Odisha, we need to address flooding in Mumbai, and for that, this public infrastructure that is required would significantly be publicly financed, and we can get public-private partnerships in the classical model work for such infrastructure to happen. So I think it's policy at the top. Intermediation failure would sort of continue because it's, by definition, it's a failure. So therefore, there needs to be a change in the risk-return relationships which capital today uses. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone.